It's winter in New York, and a bearded, noticeably older Peter Parker stares in the mirror inside the bathroom of his penthouse. He gets dressed and puts on his wedding band before stepping out of the bathroom and into the dining area where his kids, May and Richard, are already having breakfast. That's right, guys, in this reality, we get to see Peter finally settle down and start a family. Of course, who else is there to father Mr. Parker's children other than the one and only Mary Jane Watson? Or should we say Mary Jane Watson Parker? That alone is worth the price of admission to check out this fantastic Spider-Man series. MJ comes into the room to greet her hubby, asking him if he had a good night's sleep. Peter pretty much says no because he's a little antsy for what's about to happen at work that day. Later, Pete arrives at, of course, the Daily Bugle, and surprise, surprise, what's the first thing he hears? Jonah Jameson screaming Parker, of course. But don't get it twisted, guys. This version of Triple J isn't the same that we know and love. In fact, he greets Pete as J. Jonah walks past, and it's revealed that he's looking for Ben Parker, the Ben Parker. There are 3 important things that you should know about this reality before we go on. 1, it's basically a relaunch of Marvel's old Ultimate line, but instead of going back to Earth 1610, they fully revamped the Ultimate Universe, and this is now set in a reality called Earth 6160. Secondly, prior to the events of this series, the supervillain known as the Maker basically altered 6160's timeline to prevent heroes like the Fantastic Four, and of course Spider-Man, from getting their powers, which caused the events of this reality to be significantly different from the mainline Marvel universe. And third, a battle between Tony Stark Jr., the original Iron Man's kid, and the Maker ultimately led to a tragedy striking New York that left scores of people dead, and Tony Jr. being branded a villain a year prior to the events of this series. Anyway, back to our story, we find out that Ben and J. Jonah are the managing editor and publisher of the Bugle in this world, and at this point, we find out why Peter was so restless the night before. It's because he, Ben, and the rest of the Parker family are about to attend the commemoration ceremony of the so-called attack that happened the year before. This series drops another bombshell on us when we find out that one of the victims of the tragic attack from a year ago was Aunt May. Plus, we even get a cameo from Matt Murdock here as he holds a eulogy for the families of the victims. After finishing his speech, Matt calls on Harry Osborn to take the podium. In this world, guys, Harry's now the head of Oscorp, and he too suffered a loss last year when Norman Osborn, his dad, died in the attack. But more about that later. Ben's actually a bit acquainted with Harry too, since he's interviewed Norman in the past. Later, Ben and Pete arrive back at the Bugle offices to find that J. Jonah's screaming inside the meeting room before storming out and making it known to everyone around that he quits. You heard that correctly, Triple J just quit the Bugle. Ben discovers that the reason why Jonah just quit his post is because Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, basically wants to turn the Bugle into his own propaganda pamphlet. The crime boss offers Ben J. Jonah's old position at the Bugle, but he ultimately decides to quit too and strike out with Jameson. Later, Kingpin survives an assassination attempt when his SUV gets bombed by a mysterious individual who looks oh so familiar, someone riding a hoverboard and wearing green metallic armor that has a goblin-like appearance. That night, Ben and J. Jonah visit a dive bar to talk about their next move. They plan on establishing their own publication. Peter's there too, but he doesn't take his uncle's offer to work with them, given that he's pretty much doing well working for the Bugle at the moment and has a family to think about. Pete goes home and tucks his kids into bed before having some quality time with MJ. And oh man, it's not every day that we get to see these two actually talk about their relationship, instead of, seeing Pete put on the Spidey suit before MJ tells him to go get him, Tiger. In this case, Peter feels that he needs to make a change in his life. He checks in with MJ and asks her how she'd feel about this. And the only thing MJ asks for her husband is whether whatever Peter wants to do would change things between them, to which he says, never. MJ calls it a night, but before telling Pete her trademark catchphrase, we finally find out what Peter meant when he mentioned this change to his wife. Remember that metal orb that May was fidgeting around with at the beginning of the story? You see, something curious and potentially life-changing happened to Peter last night. The man who was just minding his own business when a bright light flashed inside their living room. Peter turned to look where it came from to find a small box crackling with electricity as a voice called for his name. Pete touched the box and a holographic message of Tony Stark Jr., this world's current Iron Man, appeared in front of him. Tony then told him exactly what had happened during the attack from last year, that he's being framed and that he and his companions have escaped to the future 6 months from when this message is playing. Not only that, but Tony tells him about what happened to to Earth 6160 thanks to the Maker, about how he altered its timeline to prevent people like Peter from ever gaining their powers and becoming superheroes, thereby robbing them of their destiny. But the most important part of the message happened when the box opened to reveal the metal orb that Pete has with him. Tony tells him that it contains a radioactive spider. In the present, with the rest of the Parker family in bed, Peter goes to their penthouse building's rooftop. He allows himself to be bitten, and from there, Mr. Parker's world was about to change in a big way. It only took a single month before newspapers like the Daily Bugle caught wind of this mysterious new vigilante swinging around the city. Now at this point, Pete hadn't come up with the iconic red and blue spider suit yet, so he was using the plain black suit reminiscent of the symbiote costume minus the classic white spider logo and the aggression, of course. One morning, Pete walks into the kitchen to see that May and Richard are having breakfast. May has a copy of the Bugle in hand with its headline featuring a photo of the web-swinging vigilante. They talk about it, and Richard thinks the whole thing is a hoax, but May believes it, and she's pretty scared of this masked vigilante. Later, Pete in his homemade black suit starts patrolling New York. He mentions that his body's changed a lot in the past month. His new body now requires a lot of food, and he's gotten super strong and agile. Still, he admits that he has a lot of work ahead of him. Peter has gotten the hang of swinging around the city, but he has yet to master how to properly land. Meanwhile, Ben and J. Jonah continue to plan out their new business venture. More importantly, Ben tells his best friend about a scoop that they might be able to work on, the person who's been trying to kill Wilson Fisk. They become even more resolute in pursuing this new newspaper they're establishing when they find out that the Bugle is not even covering this story, most likely at the request of Fisk himself. Somewhere else, Pete chances upon a masked burglar trying to get inside a building. This guy's wearing a pair of electric gauntlets, which gives away the fact that this is Earth 6160's version of Shocker. At this point, it's good to know that Pete doesn't lose his humor in most universes within the many Earths of Marvel, as he and Shocker get into a hilarious, awkward exchange about how much of a newbie Peter is when it comes to stopping crime. And just to show that Pete's a total noob in this reality, he even believes Shocker when the guy says he'll just quit breaking into the building and go home before offering Pete a handshake. Pete falls for it, so he takes Shocker's hand and, well, he gets electrocuted, thrown off the building, and into a dumpster. Later, Pete calls it a night when he gets home, chastising himself for falling for the old handshake trick. Thinking that everyone's asleep, he grabs some ice cream from the fridge, pulls his mask halfway up, and starts lounging on their couch. This makes him fail to notice that May has gotten up from her bed and has just seen him in his costume. The little girl almost screams, but Pete manages to calm his daughter down and tell her everything about his new life as a superhero. May agrees to keep her dad's secret, but on one condition: come up with a better non-scary costume. Meanwhile, Britain, one of the overlords of Earth 6160 directly serving under the Maker, confronts Wilson Fisk about his lackluster performance in being in charge of New York. Fisk tells Britain about the person who's trying to kill him, and Britain suggests that he let his bodyguard Bullseye deal with it. The next night, Pete goes on another one of his patrols and chances upon Shocker again. This time, Pete's not falling for any tricks, so he and the villain get into a fight. Peter gets the upper hand, and just when the Shocker is on the ropes, the electrifying burglar comes up with a story about how he's only robbing people to get medical treatment for his wife, and just like last time, Pete lowers his defenses and falls for Shocker's ruse. The supervillain blasts Pete off the building again. Unbeknownst to him and the Shocker, the same armored man trying to kill Fisk has had his eyes on the criminal this whole time. Pete goes home later that night and starts to think that maybe this whole superhero thing isn't his cup of tea, but he changes his mind when he finds a sweet note that May left him on the fridge door. A month later, MJ and Richard think that something's up with May and Pete, but the father-daughter tandem firmly denies it. But they're up to something alright. The little Parker girl is helping her dad find the perfect superhero costume. Pete tries out different suits, from ones that resemble the symbiote costume to something that looks like the one Scarlet Spider wore. May doesn't like any of these, but in the end, the two Parkers find the perfect one, that iconic red and blue classic Spider-Man suit. Later, Jonah and Ben move into the new office building they bought with their savings. It's a fixer-upper, but still, Ben's nephew admires what he's doing with Jonah. They agree to share information about possible scoops with each other, and Pete finds a bulletin board containing Ben and Jonah's research on Wilson Fisk's armored assailant. Upon finding this out, the wall crawler decides to look for this guy, which the media is now calling the Green Goblin. So Peter spends the next few days as Spider-Man trying to meet the Goblin. He almost quits the stakeout until his spider senses alert him, and he discovers that the Goblin is right in the middle of a fight against Bullseye atop New York skyscrapers. Spidey gets on the scene and sees Bullseye getting the upper hand, and Webhead intervenes when he sees the sharpshooting supervillain about to deliver Green Goblin the killing blow. But as you can tell by now, Pete is still new to all of this. Bullseye gets the best of him and slices off a crane to crash it down on both Spidey and the Goblin, commenting that he's going for a twofer, killing these two vigilantes. Green Goblin and Spidey manage to evade the crumbling crane, but Bullseye gets a hold of the battle-damaged armored vigilante again. Bullseye prepares to finally kill his original target, but Green Goblin goes full Admiral Akbar and tells his enemy it's a trap. Right then and there, Spidey jumps out of the wreckage and socks the sharpshooter right in the jaw with a solid left hook that puts his lights out. The Goblin then uses his glider to subdue the unconscious villain and take him away. With Bullseye out of the picture, Green Goblin and Spidey get to talking. The armored vigilante activates his suit to take control of Spidey's mask and take it off, exposing the man under it, Peter Parker. In turn, the Goblin reveals his secret alter ego, Harry Osborn, and they decide to grab a drink and get to know each other a little better. It's now April, and we find Peter and MJ inside a rather fancy bar. She asks her husband if it's a good idea to have this double date with Harry and his wife, but Pete reassures her that it's all good. Shortly after, Harry arrives in the restaurant and Pete introduces MJ to him. The new head of Oscorp tells him that his wife's running a little late, but he immediately receives a message that she's in front of the establishment the moment he says that. And it's here that we get the big reveal that Harry Osborn's wife is none other than Gwen Stacy. Yeah, that Gwen Stacy. The group then gets some dinner and they talk about things you'd expect from couples getting to know one another. You know the deal, career, kids, that whole jazz. Gwen finds out that MJ is running a PR firm and shows interest in her when she hears this. While all this is happening, we see that Uncle Ben and J. Jonah have actually been tasked with babysitting the kids. The two old journalists talk about their latest venture, the new publication that they're planning to launch, and it turns out that MJ helped them with naming the paper. It's gonna be called The Paper. Triple J says that he didn't really like the name at first, but he ultimately admits that calling their newspaper, well, The Paper, has a certain ring to it. Back at the restaurant, Harry and Gwen find out about the new publication that Ben and Jonah are doing, and their whole conversation takes a more serious turn as they start talking about this new vigilante swinging around New York. Gwen thinks that it's a good idea that there's going to be another paper that might potentially cover this masked crime fighter, considering that the Daily Bugle is not doing a very good job on this front. Because remember guys, Fisk is basically the owner of the Bugle right now, and it's in his best interest to keep coverage about Spidey as superficial as possible. Gwen also expresses her opinion that she's pretty much pro-Spider-Man since she believes that this vigilante's existence implies that there's something deeply wrong with their world. That's not to mention too that she and Harry are impressed with Pete's talent in photography. Hell, they even nudge him to leave the Bugle and take his talents to Uncle Ben and Triple J's fledgling paper. Gwen then excuses herself to go to the ladies' room and MJ comes with her. Mrs. Osborn basically tells MJ that she's more impressed with her and asks her for a favor to have a meeting with Ben and Jonah because Gwen is planning to fund the publication as a way to rebel against Fisk and the Bugle. At the dinner table, Harry realizes that Peter hasn't told MJ that he's actually the web-swinging vigilante going around New York. Harry then reveals Gwen knows he's the Green Goblin. Now, Harry doesn't necessarily force Pete into telling his family about his secret identity, but he does make a good point when he tells his friend that there's no way he can keep this up forever. Hearing that, Peter admits that he actually has reservations about his new crime-fighting career he's got himself into, but Harry tells him that if he's brave enough to do it, then Pete should be too. Because to Harry, he's just a guy in a suit. He can only imagine the good he can do if he had Peter's abilities. He tells Pete that it's up to them, people working outside the system, to save the world. And in a rather refreshing twist, it's Harry that drops the immortal line to Peter that with great power comes great responsibility. After the double date, Pete and MJ walk home. He asks her what she thinks of the Osborns, and MJ admits that she likes them, although they're kind of intense. Peter then asks his wife if she agrees with Gwen and Harry's opinion that their world needs heroes, to which MJ answers with a solid ride or die line when she tells her hubby that she doesn't need heroes because she has Peter in her life. In a flashback from a year ago, before the events that shook New York's foundations and killed scores of its citizens, we see Norman Osborn, Harry's dad and then current head of Oscorp, impatiently waiting for his son at a lavish gala. Norman's wife reassures him that Harry has a good reason for running late, but Norman is hearing none of it. They then get a call from Harry, who profusely apologizes to his dad, but he and Norman just end up in a huge argument when the older Osborn chastises his son for not living up to his family name. However, their squabble is cut short when an explosion hits the building that Norman and Harry's mom are in. From a short distance away, Harry can see a crimson ball of energy engulf the structure and realizes that something unimaginably horrible has just happened to his parents. Weeks pass and Harry finds himself and his wife, Gwen Stacy Osborn, meeting with their family lawyer to finalize Norman's affairs. The long and short of it is that Harry and Gwen are the only known legitimate Osborn family members left alive in this world, so they're gonna inherit everything. The meeting was just about to end when their lawyer tells him that there's just one more thing that he should know, as he hands Harry a card with a king's chess piece printed on it. He asks his lawyer what the card means, but he has no idea. What he knows, on the other hand, is who sent it to Harry. The next day, Harry goes to a heavily guarded penthouse with the calling card in his hand. It's revealed that the person who sent it is none other than Wilson Fisk, the crime lord better known as the Kingpin. Wilson asks Harry if he knows who he's talking to, and Harry tells him that he's well aware of the so-called Kingpin of New York. Fisk needs a favor from the new head of Oscorp, and like a true mob boss, Wilson is even able to spin his request to make it look like Harry should be thankful that he was the one chosen for this task. Specifically, Wilson wants Oscorp to buy off all his shares in the Stain Stark company. Well, Harry has his reservations but ultimately agrees to it just to get the gangster off of his back. 2 weeks pass after that meeting and we find Harry, Gwen, and Oscorp head of R&D, Dr. Otto Octavius. They've discovered the late Tony Stark's workshop where he kept all of his Iron Man suits. Harry and Otto are in awe of what they see inside Tony's old lab. Gwen, on the other hand, thinks it's just a case of boys and their toys. To her, the real goldmine is in the Stark database, which they promptly hack into. Within Tony's old computer, they find a treasure trove of Iron Man suit blueprints and lists of corporate assets. But what really piques their interest is a section inside the database that simply says History World. And in this point, the trio discover the secret origin of Earth 6160, and after 4 months, we find out that Dr. Octavius has just finished work on a suit that Harry commissioned him to create, the same armor that he'd be wearing as the vigilante known as the Green Goblin. This new suit basically contains Stark tech, and Otto even crafted what would be the Green Goblin's signature grenades to go along with the ensemble. Then, the genius scientist tells Harry to put on his new helmet. He wants to show his boss something. Harry does so and finds a map of the city with a few red dots. Otto informs him that each dot represents a piece of Stark tech that has been activated somewhere in the city. But here's the kicker: the image that Harry just saw was from a couple days ago. Otto shows him the map in its current state, and he finds that there are now hundreds of these little dots peppered around it. They have no idea what's causing all the Stark tech to suddenly activate, much less why this is happening simultaneously. So Harry tells his friend and employee that he's going to take his brand new suit for a spin to investigate this. Now this happens around the same time that Peter first got his spider powers, and Harry sees him getting dunked on by Shocker on one of the New York's many rooftops. It turns out that Harry has been following one of the signals from the map, which ultimately led him here, because Shocker is wearing a pair of electric gauntlets made by Stark Tech. The Green Goblin tells the 2-bit thief that he just wants the gloves and to find out where he got them in the first place, so he makes a deal with Shocker. Tell him everything, hand over the tech, and Shocker can keep all the money he stole. The villain agrees to this and tells Harry that he just got lucky a couple nights ago when he tried to rob an apartment somewhere in New York. When he got inside, he found that whoever lived there was already dead. More interestingly, there was a box in front of the dead guy with a hologram of Tony Jr. being projected from it. Well, long story short, Shocker grabbed the box, opened it, saw the gauntlets, and decided to use them as his own tools to help him with his criminal career. Right after finishing his story, Shocker decides to screw over Harry and hit him with an electrically charged punch. This does nothing to Mr. Osborn thanks to his new green Stark armor, so he knocks out the criminal and, true to his word, leaves the money there. Fast forward to a couple months before the present day of the series, Harry and Peter just met, as they mentioned in issue 3, and they go out for drinks. The two get to talking and ultimately suss out that the same people who basically handed Harry the keys to the Stained Stark fortune and the secrets that come with it are the same people who altered history to stop Peter from becoming Spider-Man in the first place. In the end, they decide to work together to find out the truth about the world. Now, we move forward another couple of months to the present day. We find that Harry has taken Bullseye, Kingpin's bodyguard, captive inside his lair. We discover that Harry has been torturing the hitman ever since he got his hands on him, but it doesn't seem to be working thanks to the exoskeleton grafted to Bullseye's entire body. Bullseye also reveals that he purposely gouged out one of his eyes as a way to revere his quote-unquote master before pretty much telling Harry that he's not going to leak out any information. At that point, Harry questions whether he's a hero or something else entirely. As he gets ready to torture Bullseye some more, he simply says that he'll find an answer to the question soon enough. Sometime later, during an otherwise ordinary morning in June, Peter walks in on the Parker family having breakfast. To the shock of Richard, May, and MJ, they see that Pete's face is all banged up, so of course, they ask him what happened. Pete tries to wave the conversation off and tell them that everything's alright, he just had an accident at the Bugle. But the Parker family isn't a bunch of dummies and they know that something is up. The secret ultimately comes out when May, in her excitement, almost blurts out that Peter got injured being a superhero. The little girl realizes that she just outed her dad, but Pete reassures his daughter that it's alright. At this point, MJ and Richard have no doubts that Peter is hiding something from them, so he comes clean and tells them the entire story, not just about what he's doing outside his job at the Daily Bugle, but about how he got his bruises. It all happened last night when Peter and Harry were staking out the Fisk building. We find out that they're planning on confronting the crime boss and roughing him up to get some answers about the Maker and his council. Pete's a little antsy about all this, saying that he's never tried to break into anyone's home before, but he ultimately agrees to it. Before going in, they get into a small argument about using codenames whenever they're in costume when Harry mentions Peter by his real name. Harry responds to this by telling his friend that neither of them have a codename, but Peter lets him know that everyone's been calling him the Green Goblin, which Harry likes. Shortly after that, they get on with their mission and burst through Fisk's sunroof. There, the crime boss was waiting for them. He informs the two vigilantes that they're a couple of idiots for not recognizing who they're dealing with, because Fisk was already 10 steps ahead. He'd been watching Peter and Harry stalk him in the previous days when the two were doing their stakeout. The Kingpin was well aware that it was only a matter of time before the Goblin and the Spider made their move, and now here they are. Wilson asks what they want from him, and Harry tells the crime boss that they want to know who he's working for. This piques Fisk's interest, which prompts him to ask where Harry got that idea. The armored vigilante tells him that Bullseye spilled the beans, and this is the first time that Spidey's hearing this. But it turns out that the Kingpin was just biding his time to finish his drink and grab a remote. At that moment, Peter's spider sense kicks in, but they're too late to react as Fisk presses a button on his remote, which traps the three of them inside a cage. A split second later, Harry is sent flying when Fisk hurls his whiskey tray right at him. Spider-Man immediately springs into action and webs up the mobster's face, but Fisk gets the best of him and manages to grab Peter by the neck. Before he could deliver the killing blow, however, Green Goblin blasts the Kingpin with an energy ray before throwing one of his patented grenades. The explosive detonates, but Harry's shocked to find it barely did anything to Fisk other than burn his shirt off, and we find out that the man has got some tattoos all over his body. More importantly though, Wilson reveals that he's had some work done recently, as he tells Harry that there might have been a time when his grenade could have injured him. Fisk lunges at the Green Goblin, and we find out the extent of the Kingpin's augmentations. He's able to crack Harry's helmet with a single punch. The Goblin falls down and desperately tries to defend himself from the mobster, but Spider-Man arrives in the nick of time to rescue his buddy. The wall crawler wraps his entire body around Kingpin's arms, but the big mob boss just grabs Pete and slams him to the ground before wailing on the masked crime fighter. Spidey takes several shots to the face before Harry recovers and calls forth his glider to crash into the building. The resulting explosion knocks back the Kingpin, and realizing that their whole fact-finding mission has gone south really quick, Harry and Pete choose to take the L and escape instead. In the present, Peter finishes coming clean to the rest of his family. Richard's not too happy about the fact that his dad did a whole B&E with Harry, but Pete tells the kid that he had to do it and stop something way more evil. May then asks her dad if he's planning on a rematch with Fisk, and Pete all but says yes. Meanwhile, MJ can't help but be worried and asks him if they're going to be safe. Peter reassures everyone that no harm will come to the Parker family, but it's important that his secret identity as the web-swinging hero of New York remains a secret between the four of them. Pete then tells his family that the only reason he hid it from MJ and Richard up until now was because he couldn't find the right moment to reveal it. His wife and his son understand Pete's dilemma, so they let it go. At this point, Peter just wants to have a private talk with MJ, so he sends the kids to bed. Afterwards, the couple go into their bedroom like a typical husband caught in a lie. Peter braces himself for MJ's wrath. But she tells him that she's not mad at all. Rather, MJ feels a mix of pride, fear, and admiration for what Peter is doing as the masked vigilante. They fall quiet for a bit, and Pete correctly guesses that his wife wants to see his Spidey suit. So he puts it on, and MJ thinks it suits Peter well. She then asks him what she should call him whenever Peter is in costume, and he replies by saying that maybe MJ's marketing savvy can help with that. Well, she points to the spider emblem on his chest and tells her husband that the codename he's been looking for has been right on the costume the whole time. Moments later, Peter goes out and takes MJ for a swing around New York, now donning the name Spider-Man.